They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. They said it low enough for wind to scatter, loud enough for minds to catch. The words slid across the saloon floorboards like sugar on a cedar plank and sank into the grain. Evening came on the town slow and sand-colored, bringing with it the thin, silver light of a new moon and the smell of coffee cooling in tin cups. The town had a single street, a post office with one cracked window, a blacksmith who knocked out horseshoes as if the rhythm were breathing, and a saloon that held the height of all its people's opinions. In that saloon she worked, a plain-spoken woman with a stove-smudged apron and a fistful of holdbacks in her chest. They called her Molly Thorne because somebody had to say something when she came in, brushing dust from the hem of a skirt patched 2 summers ago. They said Molly like it was a small thing. They said Thorne like it should prick. Molly's hands were always warm from the coffee pot or the tea kettle, calloused from mending harnesses and from threading needles through clothes that had been used up by life. Her hair was the color of hay in late August, pulled into a knot that held its own against wind. Her eyes were the kind that recorded things in careful film and did not give away much, not even to the ones who thought a woman on her feet ought to be turned down. She had been widowed by a fever and had come to town with only a trunk and a number of old regrets that feathered the inside of her ribs. She kept serving and cleaning because it was work that could be named and finished. She kept the stove hot because the warmth told her she still could. Outside the saloon doors the prairie breathed, a wide chest of various greens and browns that shimmered under the sky. There were wind sounds, long and patient, rubbing dust into the cracked boards of houses and making the wooden signs creak like old men telling the same story. When the doors opened, light from the inside hit the street like a promise, and the creak of hinges was a public announcement. Inside, the saloon smelled of stew, of old leather, of whiskey warmed by hands that had been working hard or gambling late. Boots made music on the floor. Sometimes a fiddle provided a lonesome counterpoint, sometimes the stretch of a man's laugh. But mostly there was the work. Mugs refilled, bread sliced, plates scraped. Molly moved through it all with a quiet authority. She served beans and pie and coffee with the same steady hands that had once rocked a cradle and later had steadied a crippled plow. People looked at her and found something in the lines of her face that didn't fit with their opinions. They called her plain, but they did so without thinking how sharp her plainness actually was. They mocked the patched apron and they wondered why a woman would not have someone to watch over her. But she kept standing, cutting the meat, pouring the coffee, tying the napkin over someone's wound because the saloon sometimes doubled as the town's infirmary for cuts and broken hearts. She accepted their words as if they were wind, felt them, adjusted, and carried on. They had their small cruelties made polite. Mrs. Pelham, who ran the boarding house and had a doctrine for every cracked teacup, would come into the saloon with her starched skirts and lift a chin the way she lifted sugar into her tea. "My dear," she would say over the rim of her cup when Molly passed, "are you not wearing that same apron you had last winter?" Molly would lower her head a little, thumb brushing the corner of the cloth where a seam threatened to come undone, and answer only with a small, steady smile. Those were the small public humiliations. A comment about a dress, a question about whether she was expecting no guests. All soft and deadly, sharpened by a whole town watching like a jury. She bore them without reply because she had learned early that answers fed gossips and that silence was sometimes a way of keeping more than the moment, sometimes a way of keeping peace. The other people of the town, the ones with land and with fathers who once owned more than a mile of earth, measured worth by horses and by cattle and by how often a hat was rebrushed. They were the sort of people who could pronounce a woman unfit or too proud or too foolish without batting an eye. They jostled each other on the stoop and said, "She's good in a fight, but no place for a woman," and turned back to their cards. They believed that a true woman's place was safe and small and unquestioning. Molly was not small. She kept her head high and let the world make what comments it wanted. He came the first time on a day the sky had been iron blue and the wind had whistled like an old train. He rode a horse whose ribs wouldn't show and whose coat shone like soot under the sun. His boots were dark and worn. His hat sat respectful on his head when he walked into the saloon, hat in hand for that manner of greeting that still had sense in it. He moved with a kind of economy that suggested someone more used to saying no than yes. When he spoke, it was as if his words had been saved all day, small and measured. He had a look about him that made people clear the room in a way that was polite and plain. They let him fill a space with his silence, and then they went about being loud in other ways. There was a reputation that arrived with him the way dust followed a wagon. Formerly of the West, they said, or of things that reeked of trouble and glory both. It was hard to say which. "No one knows you," someone ventured to Mrs. Pelham, who was perched like a gull by the stove. "Must be one of them types. Probably an old ranch hand," another said. "Or some ex-sheriff trying to retire." He moved to the bar and set his hat down, eyes sweeping the room and landing, for a second that felt sticky, on Molly. There was a shape of curiosity in those eyes that didn't do the usual thing. Didn't look for weakness or for something to laugh at. He studied the way she flipped a pan, how her hands moved over mugs as if they were maps that had to be read, and did not look away. He held his stare and then turned to his drink. Unseen by most, the one who watched most often was the town's small-schemed gladness, a woman named Ida Renshaw, who could prick a conversation and set it boiling. She liked to sit where gossip had a clear view, and she liked to judge like a person handing out ration sunlight. "He's probably just another hard-luck joke," she told the bartender, fingers neat around a glass that didn't need steadying. "You don't get a pardon for looking good, Ida," came a voice that could cut a thread. The speaker was Dan Pelham, son of the boarding house matron, born with a silver spoon and a narrow mind. He smirked and watched the interplay like a man cataloging birds. He could be trouble. Always is, apparently. Molly heard him, but she was already occupied with another task. A child had come in with a scraped knee, and the child's small face was set in the particular hardness children get when something hurts. She knelt and cleaned the wound with a cloth and a careful hum, while the saloon's talk went on around them. The child's mother, a tired woman named Ruth with a face like tobacco stained by life, thanked Molly with a whisper. Molly kept her hands steady and her answer small. "It's nothing," she said. Her voice had a husk of quiet that always made people soften when they didn't expect to. The cowboy, he had that look like he was used to seeing bad things and staying in control, watched her. Something in his expression bent like a branch under weight and did not break. Something like pity and something like admiration lay together in his gaze. He did not speak. He simply watched, and the watching changed the air between them in a way that the room's chatter could not. That night, when Molly stacked the plates and wiped the counter, the wind came under the doors in thin ribbons and the floorboards sang a tired hymn. She shut the saloon and swept the dust into small heaps. The town slept in fits and starts. The few who stayed late nodded and found their way home, carrying the smell of stew and the memory of a laugh. The cowboy left his hat on the bar and, when no one was looking, wrote his name on the back of a flyer tacked to the wall, a list of a ranch for sale in a neighboring county, and for a moment the room felt quieter than it had a right to be. He walked out under the pale finger of moonlight, the prairie around him a cooling chest, days folded like paper. He came into the saloon again and often sat with his hat in hand, glancing over the rim from time to time toward where Molly moved. People noticed. Talk works like a fever in a small town. It grows and grows until it covers everyone's thoughts. They said he was a stranger who'd come to pass time, or that he was hiding something, or that he had been on the road long enough to forget any town he might have sworn loyalty to. They added details. The sparks in their mouths made anything plausible. But the truth was quieter and built from small things. The way he lifted the colt from the mud behind the stable without being asked. The way he pushed his chair back and stepped in when a horse bolted at the fairground and no one else moved fast enough. He did the jobs that needed to be done, and did them with a measured hand. Molly noticed the small kindnesses the same way a person notices spring when it first creeps up, slowly and in places few would expect. He left the door open for her when she came in at dawn with a pail of eggs. He tossed a dry scrap of jerky into the kitchen where she worked when his own plate was empty. He paid his tab without fuss. Sometimes their hands brushed as he accepted a cup of coffee. Both held still as if expecting another current to pass. She kept working, not letting voice climb to say anything that might pry the shape of a new thing into the open. Silence was, to her, a kind of balance. When the songs came quicker and the saloon filled with its usual dozen characters on Saturday nights, the small kindnesses were harder to keep secret. The town noticed. The small cruelties sharpened to a public scale. Ida stood longer in the doorway, watching and measuring the distance between them like a seamstress judging the hem. "I always thought a quiet woman had less to hide," she said one night, loud enough for the room to riff on. "What does a woman like that need with a man like him?" Molly's hands stopped for a fraction. She turned the pan as if remembering to keep the stew moving. Her face did not give. The cowboy watched Ida and then watched Molly, like a person who has been asked to measure something and realizes that the rules were not what he thought. He stood, came to the side where she worked, and said in a voice low as a folded blanket, "She don't need anything except peace." The room took a breath. Dan Pelham laughed, the sound small and sharp. "Peace? Since when do you speak for others, stranger?" He did not rise to the bait. He straightened like a man turning the key in a door only he knew how to open and said, "I reckon I know what's right when I see it." That was not a statement made to impress. It landed like a pebble in a still pool, larger ripples than the speaker intended. Molly's cheeks warmed in a way that did not translate to a smile. She kept serving. The town kept talking. They kept their questions like arrows. But for the first time since she came to town, someone had said her name loud enough that it mattered. Peaceful, steady, purposeful. The inciting act of kindness came like so many things, quiet and expensive in its own currency. A family had been struck by illness on the east fence of town. A man crippled by fever and a wife who had to leave the market to tend to him. Their youngest, a boy with a cough that shook his ribs, needed a warm blanket and someone to set the kettle to singing. It was the sort of matter that typically got a nod and a prayer in that town because people believed providing the basic was an act that mattered only in public, not in quiet corners. Molly heard about it through whispers and the scatter of a note pinned to the post office door. She went on a morning when the sky was still raw and the world looked like it had been painted in thin washes of gray. On the porch where the family lived, a low two-room place with a sagging roof, Molly set down her basket. The wind came through the slats and made a lonely sound. The wife's eyes were wide and frightened and full of a kind of tired that had nothing to sing about. Molly lifted her chin a little and asked the small question that can make a difference. "Is there water?" They had none to spare for washing. So Molly boiled her kettle, went inside, and made thick broth that tasted like comfort they had nearly forgotten. She washed the child's face and hands and saw the fever in the small eyes. Then, in a quiet, deliberate act, she tore one of the seams of her own apron to make an extra bandage for the child's cough. The seam effort was a small thing to most, but to Molly it was taking without asking what she might need tomorrow. Her hands trembled slightly when she did it because she knew it would make the next morning feel a little colder. The woman wanted to speak to Molly with more thanks than their town allowed. Molly would not let them build a debt upon her basic kindness. "You come to town every night and you do good," the woman said, fingers rubbing the child's forehead. "You don't ask nothing for it." Molly settled into the chair and pulled the child's blanket higher, the wind tugging at the edges. "I don't need to," she said softly, like a person who knows what it's like to be left with nothing but the quiet. When she left, Ida was there on the fence, arms folded and an expression that said she'd been right about everything from the beginning. "You can't keep giving everything away," Ida said, as if she were a ledger and the world owed her honesty. Molly looked at Ida with that same even gaze she had used all her life. "Nobody asked me to keep it," she said. Her voice was small but with the weight of one who had learned how to lean on the truth. It was the cowboy who had been sent by habit or curiosity to check the family's porch. He met Molly on the road, hat in hand, and watched her tie her apron strings once, twice, as if making sure. "You shouldn't give away your things like that," he said. Molly shook her head and the motion felt like care. "You don't pay for being kind," she said. "Maybe not," he answered, looking at the rutted track. "But you pay anyhow. Someone's always giving when they don't have much. You did the right thing, miss." He stopped because he hadn't asked her name. He had called her Miss and then found the word inadequate. Molly finally said, "Molly, Molly Thorne. Molly," he repeated, the name falling into his mouth like an accord. He lifted his hat so the wind could catch the brim and made a small motion. The kind had something humbling in it. "I don't reckon I'd say it any better." He was not the only one who saw. The town saw the clean way he observed her kindness and began to shift their tongues to a new story. There's a difference between giving and being seen giving. Being seen comes with a risk of judgment, of rumor, of being dragged too far into public light. But when a stranger saw, when he lent his notice, the act became something the town couldn't as easily mismeasure. Molly felt that noticing like a hand balanced on a shoulder. Her face warmed again and then settled. She had been humiliated before and she had survived it. This was different. This felt like support. But the quiet things of a heart rarely stay quiet for long. Ida, whose life was a ledger of small jabs and public shames, began to shape a chorus that would make the small town talk itself into a sound resembling a storm. She spoke of improprieties that did not exist, planted seeds that took root in threatened minds. "Who needs that sort of attention?" she said. She could be looking for trouble. The sheriff, a man who believed his authority was granted by all who gave him fear, added a hushed insult and stories were formed. Then, on a day where summer had dug its teeth into the land and every roof smoldered, something happened that would cut the town in two. A man on a freight train came through with a new-fashioned rifle and a knife meant for skinning more than bread. He had been drinking all day and his temper was flammable. He had been to other towns and taken what he wanted. He came into the saloon as a storm does and looked for a place to land. He found it in Molly, if only because she was there and he had a grievance that did not belong to her. "Keep your apron tied, girl," he sneered, reaching for a glass. "You serve the men proper." Molly's face was a mask that had learned to hold such things without breaking. The saloon quieted like a room whose temperature has shifted. Even the fiddle stopped. Ida's lips were shaped like someone who would call for a lynch. She loved public shame the way some mothers love the smell of a baby. Before anyone could step forward, the man pushed a chair and laughed. "You laugh too loud," he said, and for a breath, the room wanted the fight he promised. People put hands in pockets, palmed knives that weren't needed yet, and looked for a name to pick sides. Dan Pelham, with a bravado like a dog with a new bone, said something from behind a glass. The cowboy stood. He had been watching like he always did, quiet as a dog by a hearth. He kept his hand by his side and his face unmoving, the same way he'd had it 100 times when animals faltered and men forgot how to be kind. He walked forward until he was just behind Molly and put his hat on the shelf as if he had decided to stay for a while. When the drunken man shoved his way too close and put his palm to Molly's shoulder as a mark of his supposed power, the cowboy took the hand and said, quietly, "You leave her be." The wrong man said the wrong thing. When the man turned toward him, a sneer on his face, the cowboy let his jaw harden like a joint that had been used too many winters. "You talk to folks like that and you're liable to find you're the one in the dirt," he said. It was a simple sentence without flourish, but said by him it had weight like a rolling log. The man swore and swung. The cowboy moved like he had been keeping a ledger of motion his whole life. One step, a steady grip, and the man was on the floor, breath knocked out of him like wind from a fire. The saloon gasped the way a town gasps when it is suddenly aware of itself. Shame fell over the crowd that had been leaning forward. Ida glared as though the cowboy were a provocation to everything she had cultivated. Dan Pelham pushed forward to take credit where there was none, to say he would have handled it, but the cowboy was done. He turned to Molly, took his hat, touched the brim to his chest in a small motion of respect and asked no more. The act had been small, like a nail hammered home. Its sound moved outward. It made Molly's eyes water in the way of a person whose chest had been long accustomed to swallowing down pieces. She did not speak about the blow. She tended the man on the floor as if mending a skewed lantern. He was not heroic. He was merely a human being who had overstepped. Some of the regulars muttered about the cowboy being an outsider, said he had no right to step in, but the stain of the drunk man's behavior was plain for all to see. It was a public humiliation turned into an act of salvation. Molly felt that surge inside, a fierce heat that worried her fingers like a child. After that night, the balance shifted. People who had made a sport of prying began to look elsewhere. The cowboy kept coming, his steps measured. He did the odd job around town, took a fence break when harvest ate the days, and hauled a load of wood to Mrs. Kilgore, who had once been the mayor's wife and was now no more than bones and grace. He started leaving small things where needed. Some fresh bread, a mended saddle, the quiet use of a man with a past who knows how to be of help. He left, sometimes, a note tied to a bottle of ink with a line that made her mouth find a small smile and then drop back to work. They never spoke of the things that had led him here. The town filled in nonsense. People thought he had been a bandit. He had been a soldier once, he would say later, but at first he let the rumors form like storm clouds. There was a carefulness about him, an unspoken vow that he would not put his past on the table uninvited. Molly noticed that he watched her, not with hunger or with needing, but with a kind of respect that had room for her whole person. He didn't stand too close. He did not say, "You look pretty," or "You look tired," like men who confuse noticing with owning. He simply did small things that softened the edges of her days. A stick of wood left by the back door, a bowl of stew where her balcony was empty. Once he found a locket with a turn of a hinge that said nothing and everything. When Molly opened it, she found a lock of hair and a pressed piece of paper with handwriting she could not read. He did not pry. He handed the locket, hat in hand, and said, "You lost this," as if he'd merely tidied up something the wind had misplaced. There was that steadiness again, like a man who had learned to hold things with care. Their reconnection deepened not in dramatic sweeps but in the way of worn roads. They would sit in the early light on the saloon steps while the town came out and the sky had that cold color that told you life was about to begin again. She would shell peas while he tightened the straps on a saddle. He asked questions about how she had learned to plait hay, and she asked where he'd come from. The answers were brief. Both were people used to not filling spaces where silence was the better part. But in the quiet minutes, their hands would brush, and they'd keep them there longer than was necessary. The prairie around them listened like an old aunt who liked to hear people confess slowly. He had been through a war that had left scars he did not like to display. Once, when he thought they were the only ones on the porch and the moon had the patience to watch, she asked, "Did someone tell you how to be so steady, or did you teach yourself?" He paused, hat in hand. "Easy to be steady when you have to be," he said. "Hard to let it go." That was a truth neither of them had to bend to understand. Their confessions came like this, short, certain, with the room between them left for the rest. They shared no kisses yet. Their mouths found that to be a later, larger thing. Instead, they found the warmth of a hand on a cup of coffee and the security of someone who would show up when the weather broke. It was Ida and a few others who wanted the drama. The town was a place that liked to flourish stories like flags and then wave them about until they were ragged. Ida, whose tongue had always found the place to push, started to push harder. Her criticisms sharpened, made crueler by alcohol and the desire to be relevant. "She hides under kindness so no one knows she's trying," Ida said one evening, her voice a string of nettles. "And look at him, haunting the place like a shadow. Who knows what he wants? The small-town shamer has a way of making people more cruel than they are alone, of creating a mob with salt instead of water." Her words found fertile soil. Men who wanted to see a spectacle leaned forward, and the world watched Molly like a glass of something fragile. Dan Pelham, who had been humiliated in front of the saloon when the cowboy had put the drunk on his back, used the moment to revive self-importance and began to chart steps to restore his rank. He mocked the cowboy as an outsider, and in mocking him he thought to reclaim a spotlight. The cowboy, for his part, kept quiet. He watched the way a man who is used to being watched does, measuring, keeping his balance, waiting for the right moment to move. The town called a meeting once, a gathering on the courthouse steps where people speak as if their words could bind more tightly than a lariat. The sheriff stood at the center, chewing on a cocky piece of a cigar. "It's been said," he began in the thick voice of the man who thinks law is his to define, that some among us have been acting out of order. Ida, who had pinned a look like victory to her face, stepped forward to give names that the town could chew over. "There's a stranger in our town," she said plainly, "and he encourages trouble by bullshit. He has no standing and no silk. He walks like a man who does not belong to us." Molly watched from the side street with her hands clasped around a basket. The crowd looked at her like a piece in a game. The man at her side, the cowboy, didn't flinch. He stepped forward, hat in hand, and said, "Molly's done more good for this town than half the folks who've got livings paid by it. She's feed children, tended the sick, and kept fire in the stove for folks that couldn't afford a proper name. You don't get to shame a person for living like that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ida's face darkened. The sheriff pursed his lips. Dan tried to make an affront into a spectacle by drawing himself up like a man who'd heard a personal challenge and was ready to take a stand. But the cowboy's voice carried, low and even, and it had something in it that made men remember the truth of their better selves. That is what he did. Not fight scandal with scandal or abuse with vehemence, but with the simple, true listing of facts. It was the truth that stuck to the town's skin. They did not exile the shamer. They could not unmake the habit of tongues. But for a while, Ida's voice hollowed as the men who had thought of her as a clever judge realized that the rightness of the man beside Molly could not be so easily dismissed. The crowd dispersing, the judge of the town's rights pouting like a child who had not had his cake. The slow and steady kindness on the porch remained. The climax came on the fair day, when the town arranged tables and hung bunting that caught on every breeze and made the air full of color. It should have been a day for lightness. Instead it became the place where the pressure they'd all felt came to a point. An argument started over a disputed poker game, and words unraveled the way loose thread will. Dan Pelham, having drunk too much, took offense at the cowboy's quiet refusal to take his side, and then to everything. He stepped forward with words sharpened by whiskey. "You have no business telling us who to mind, stranger," he spat. "You're a nobody. You're a—" He never finished. The cowboy stood, and in a move that was both slow and fierce, he said, "You've made a point of causing trouble all summer, Dan. You run folks down because you think it makes you taller. You don't. You keep your voice and let folks live." Dan stepped up too close, eyes bright, ego at full. He swung. The cowboy moved like every moment of his life had been practiced for this. A step, a parry, a hold. When the sheriff tried to intervene, Dan pushed the lawman's hand away and dragged the crowd into a place where a punch might mean more than embarrassment. The cowboy, pressed by the crowd and the weight of too many men, finally acted to protect. He moved with a precision that told stories of years of hard choices. He didn't look for the thrill of a fight. He took a shove and held, and Dan fell with a sound that made the fairground quiet as a grave. Ida's voice rose like a hawk and shrieked that the cowboy had no right. She said he had assaulted an upstanding citizen. The sheriff, who was more used to ceding to loud mouths than to reading justice in real measures, got in a huff and attempted to take the cowboy into custody. The cowboy let the man speak until he had had his fit of authority. Then, in the hush that followed, he moved with the slow power of someone who tells the truth in gestures. He pushed his cap back and said, "You can't jail what's right, Sheriff." By then the town had divided into two islands. Those who watched the cowboy with awe and those who defended their old narratives. Molly felt the old heat start to rise in her chest, that pressure like someone wanting to cry but having no proper place. She stayed quiet the way she always did. But a boy in the crowd threw a stone at Dan. The stone found the man's cheek, and then someone else hurled something else. The crowd sank into the kind of petty violence that is easier to do than to feel. The cowman's eyes met Molly's across the circle. The look said simply, "Stand by." He stepped between and the rest of them followed in a slow domino. Words gave way to an action that required him to step forward, to throw himself between the town's worst instincts and the one he'd grown to care for quietly. He took Dan by the arm and said, flatly, "You leave her and you leave me be." The sheriff, having felt his authority threatened, tried to draw a pistol. The world inhaled sharply. Then Dan, who had been built of bluster and fragile ego, realized he had reached the limit of his performance. He slunk back, pride stinging like a scald, and the sheriff put up his gun without a shot. The crowd came back to a hum like bees in the evening. The moment of public humiliation passed, and the cowboy stood unclipped but unbowed like a man who had measured the cost of a thing and paid it. Freedom can be an odd thing. He had stepped into a place that cost him something. Attention, the town's gossip, more than a few hard glances, and he had come out with the more important thing. He had also bartered a small portion of his past reputation and tucked it away in a pocket no one else could touch. For Molly, the impact was not the drama itself but the shape of the man's rescue. She kept her face neutral, but her hands trembled as she set out the carafe with coffee. Her stomach felt like a place that had been emptied and then filled again with something warm. The barroom was calmer than it had been for a long time. The town, as towns do, returned to its rhythms. People made their jokes again, but less voluntarily cruel than before. The shamer had been softened by the day. Perhaps it was the sight of someone being willing to stand up that made everyone catch their breath and choose restraint. The blacksmith hammered with a steadier hand. The children played games on the green without being watched too closely. Some nights the saloon felt like the center of everything. Other nights the post office hummed with letters and the bakery with yeast. But through it all there was this undercurrent, a possibility that maybe kindness could be chosen and that cowardice could be seen for what it was. What followed over the next months was not the burst of a love that consumes but the slow building of a hut on firm ground. Molly and the cowboy, whose name she had learned slowly, Wyatt Hale, a name with the sort of old country cadences that told you he'd been shaped by hard things, built trust like two hands laying boards. They told each other small truths while the days warmed and cooled. Molly told him about the man she'd married and the fever that had taken him. She did not say much about how the lull after his death had pulled a soft curtain around her days. Wyatt told her about a brother who'd gone missing in a border town and about the shame of a past that had demanded better than what it got. They sat often and worked in silence, and sometimes they surprised each other with a confession, like two people at different times remembering a shared dream. There came a night when she was alone on the saloon porch, the moon a dish of silver that had no interest in telling secrets. She had been mending a child's shirt and found the small pleasure that comes with making something usable again. Wyatt had not come that night. She felt the pinch of absence but also that space that was part of love. You could lose someone by absence or be relieved with the shape of your own steady beating heart. He came in late, the click of his boots measured as if counting breaths. He did not declare his arrival with words. He put his hat in his hands and sat, the same way he always had. He took the cup of coffee she placed before him and said nothing. Silence stretched. The wind came with its own language, tapping at the window and singing against the post. Molly waited. Finally, Wyatt said, "You ever think of leaving?" She glanced up, thread in hand, needle in the crescent of work. "Sometimes," she said, and there was no shame in the admission. "The road would be plenty with my name on it." Wyatt smiled, the sort of smile that spoke of 1,000 restrained things. "I've been thinking I could use a partner for the road," he said. There was an invitation in his voice. He was not asking for a surrender but for a choice. Molly put down the needle. "I could ride," she said. "But my place is here for now." "That's different than saying you won't go," he said. "I could buy a hat and learn to ride like a man, but I don't know if I want to be a man," she said with a small, steady laugh. "I reckon I'd like to be someone who knows how to live where she is. I like a stove with a proper flame." Wyatt's hands tightened around the tin cup as if weighing a truth. "You don't owe the world nothing but your own happiness," he said simply. "Not to it or to anyone in it." The months that followed were deep with the slow labor of two people learning to make a place for themselves. They worked together on the ranch he acquired outside of town. The land was dry but honest, with a barn that had to be braced and a fence that needed mending. Molly learned to ride and to rope and to read the sky for storms, but she learned in her own way, not a copy and not a concession. Wyatt taught her to find the center of a saddle, how to balance when a horse bolted and how to coax rather than command. She taught him how to sit still with a pot of stew, how to thread a needle into a delicate place, how to tend an animal with gentleness rather than strength alone. They shared the chores so that each stayed stitched together by a series of small acts. Wyatt began to unspool his past like a spool of thread. He spoke of a war that left him a man who didn't know what to do with being looked at, of mistakes in other counties that had forced him to the edges. He didn't ask her to forget his history. He asked only that she see him. In return, he saw her with the clarity of someone who had watched a single star become a map. They did not race to a wedding. The town did not demand one either. People waited in their own ways and allowed the two to come together at their own speed. There was a carefulness to the slow stew of their days, a rhythm where each act was its own promise. He learned to call her by her name in public without pretense, and she taught him how to say nothing when nothing needed saying. The binding between them was not a fireworks display but rather a hearth that had been kept lit through rain, kept in mind without boasting. There were nights still when the past threatened to undo it all. A stranger would come to town asking for Wyatt by an old name, a letter from a place he had left months prior, a memory that bent him toward something that could not be fixed. When those ghosts came, Wyatt would drag the weight by holding to the small things. A coffee cup, a mended fence, Molly's hand. She would sit with him and place the small things into his hands like anchors. At times he had to face people with old grievances and tell them plainly of the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to be. He had to make amends not by force but by the difficult labor of showing up. He did, and sometimes it cost him sleep, and some nights he woke with a cold hand of regret. Molly's inner life had its own past-buried storms. She had a brother who had taken the road and never written back, a mother who died in a small house while her head was full of prayers, and a grief that moved like a slow tide. She had carried shame about wanting things, cooking for a family, of being valued beyond what others deemed her worth. Wyatt never belittled the way she'd coped. He believed in the things she had earned by showing up. He honored her ache without dramatizing it. That gentle respect shaped a new thing in Molly, to allow herself little moments of need. She let him see her cry sometimes when the moon was so bright and the air was so cold that grief came like a wave. He held her and said nothing, and the quiet beyond that was a softer confession. In the midst of their building, a winter came sharp and sudden. Snow wrapped the town in white and the world went quiet as if someone had thought to hush it. The saloon stove had to be fed in the night more than once. The animals needed to be brought closer to the barn, and the roads were closed by drifts that seemed like mountains to small ankles. The winter sadness hit hard and tested the notion of what partnership meant. One evening, as the cold wrapped around them and the lamplight made everything glow like a sepia photograph, a fever took hold of a child in the next-door town. The nearest doctor was a day's ride and the roads were slick with ice. Molly knew what it was to have a fever take a person quickly. It had been her life once to have to choose whether to put the stove out or to keep the kettle singing. She and Wyatt bundled up and took the horse, a stubborn mare with enough strength for hauling loads and for small mercy. The answer to that ride was a risk. The town watched them go with a sort of prayer that was like a held breath. They rode through wind that cut like a barber's blade, through snowdrifts that swallowed the trail. Molly felt the wind in her face like a baptism, cold and awake. Wyatt's hands were steady on the reins, but once his face tightened when the mare slipped and nearly took them both with her. Molly reached for his hand in the narrow place between them and felt the truth, that this was a man who practiced being present. They arrived at the house with a child who needed warmth and stayed, sitting with the family while the night was a long, cold thing. He brewed tea with roots the woman said were good for fevers. They sat with the kettle and the child and watched the watchfulness of being needed. The ride back was quiet but purposeful, and it felt like another thing they had done to stitch life back together. When spring came, the thaw was an absolution. The land unfolded like a palm. The town felt like a place that had been given time to reset. Molly and Wyatt had a growing life outside of the town. They had a few acres and a barn with bats and a dustiness that seemed to be the price of having a place. The people who had once called her just the help found fewer words for her. There were still tongues that wagged, still beady eyes that measured and judged, but they were a background of noise rather than the central measure. The greatest change was not in them. It was in Molly. She could look at herself in a basin set on the porch and find that she had more courage to do nothing than she had ever given herself credit for. One evening in late spring, in a quiet that felt as if it were held in sacred trust, Wyatt put his hat in both hands and told her that he'd taken to calling the place beyond the town their place. "You've made a home with me, Molly," he said, voice low, eyes bright like the embers of a stove. "I reckon I could leave a notion that someone ought to wait. I don't want to make claims that sound like thunder. I just want to know if you'd like to stay." She looked at him, the way one reads a map of the horizon and finds its beauty plain. "There's been a lot of good things here," she said slowly. "But I won't be anyone's shadow." "I hope not," he said, a laugh like a dry twig. "I don't do shadows." Molly let the silence between them swell and settle. "I could stay," she said. "For now, at least. Maybe longer if the stars lean." He put the hat on his head and pulled her in unhurried. Their lips found each other in the way of two people who had been learning to build a house and had finally placed the roof. It was a kiss that had waited and waited. It was the kind of touch that held the weight of all their little sacrifices. When they pulled away, the world seemed to stand still for a breath. The small town, with its gossip and its praise and its petty cruelties, did what towns do. They watched from windows and whispered into the night. Some said their blessings in the same low way they had once leveled slings. Others said nothing. They settled into the life of building together, the boring and the holy work, mending roofs, making bread, sharing mornings, and dealing with the trivialities of being two people in a world with little space. They built their love in a manner that refused drama and asked only that you wake each day and put out a plate for the other. Love, in their hands, meant making coffee and a place by the fire. Months later, when the wheat had been cut and lay like a golden wave outside the town, Ida Renshaw came to the porch with a pie. It was a small offering, the shy kind made by someone who wanted an anchor. "You both look good," she said, more honest now than she'd been in years. "Might be something in you I misread." "I was wrong." Molly smiled with a softness like a blanket. "We all have things to learn," she said. The town changed slowly. People who once had been certain of their judgments found themselves thinking twice. Dan Pelham moved away with pressed buttons and a wounded ego that he could not soothe. The sheriff learned that his authority might come with a responsibility to be fair. The blacksmith adjusted the measure of his own heart. These small changes are not dramatic, but they are the only sort that will hold to the weather. Years marched with their quiet, steady feet. Molly and Wyatt's life wasn't a straight line to a fairy tale. They had hard tasks. Drought took a barn. A sickness claimed a horse. A neighbor's child died, and the town had to learn what it meant to grieve together. But the core truth stayed. They were each other's choice. They made compromises and kept their independence in ways that strengthened, rather than weakening, what they had. They had a child. A girl with hair the color of summer wheat and eyes that favored Molly's stubborn streak. They named her June. For the month, the town had finally stopped worrying about other people's shadows. Molly grew gentler with herself. Where she had been quick to swallow taunts and keep moving, she learned to say things that mattered. Wyatt remained steady, yet he learned how to let himself be loved without assuming the role of rescuer. June grew in a house where her mother could patch a shirt and her father could hold a lullaby like a tool. The saloon remained a place of work for Molly on special nights when the townspeople wanted their pie and their gossip together. But eventually she closed it up to spend more days on the ranch. There were quiet days by the stove when Wyatt would put his hat in his hand and Molly would set a cup of coffee there. They would look at each other across the table and let silence do its slow, warm work. They had learned to share small mercies. Molly sometimes thought of the time she had been mocked, of Ida's early jabs, and felt something that was close to pity, not just for Ida but for the idea that people had once had of her. She had been the moral center not because she had been perfect but because she had been stoic enough to go on, kind in the ways that people tend to forget count. Wyatt had been buried by a past of his own making, and he had come back up by principal acts of gentleness. Together they had excavated a life. Time, which is the slowest and often the kindest teacher, made their edges soft. Winter's hair grayed the two of them in season, and the town found that what they'd once had as gossip was now a story other folks decided to borrow, not to repeat. They put a porch swing on the house and later a small cradle for June's own child. There were letters from people they had helped, a postcard from a far town where someone they'd been kind to had prospered. In those small missives you could see the way kindness circles back, slowly and in unexpected places. At the end of it, when the last great challenge had been met and the fields had been properly set for next harvest, Molly sat on the porch and looked at Wyatt. He had his hat on his knee and big hands that had nothing left to prove. They had walked through a town that liked to shame and fixed it with the only thing that could be trusted. Steady, unshowy fairness and small acts that counted. "You said once you'd never set your hat in a place you didn't mean to make your own," she said. "I still reckon I could tame every wild horse that crosses my path," he said softly, hat in his hands. "But never my heart around you." Molly looked out at the prairie. The wind moved the tall grasses like a breath, and the place seemed to hold them both to its soft weight. The saloon's door creaked in her memory, and she imagined the town the way a reader imagines the end of a book, with everything that mattered in its right place. She reached for the cowboy's hand and found it there, warm, calloused, and held. If her story hit you hard, the narrator would say if we were to speak straight to the ears of any that listened, don't forget the ones who stay quiet. If you've ever been that person, take a minute to say their name aloud. They do the work of the world with a silence that's nearly holy. They had both given much without asking. And finally, someone had given back without making it a show. The town's small cruelties had not vanished, but they had been softened by a truth that one man's steadiness and one woman's kindness could do more than battle. They could outlast. On a porch full of sunlight and a life that had become home, Molly rested her head on his shoulder. The prairie hummed, a hymn in the key of wind. And that's how a whisper changed a town.